Now that we have discussed some of the hazards present in disasters and steps you can take to maintain your well-being, let's talk about the actual role of a disaster volunteer, whether generally or specifically as relates to first aid. Official disaster response agencies recognize that disaster volunteers play a vital role in responding to disasters. Disaster volunteers often arrive at a disaster before an organized response can be implemented and can provide information about disaster victims in the local communities. Particularly in first aid, a disaster volunteer providing care can make the difference between life and death for disaster victims. For example, severe bleeding from an artery can lead to death in a matter of minutes, long before EMS responders arrive. A disaster volunteer such as yourself, taking action to stop the bleeding, can significantly increase the possibility of survival. Such care is even more vital when a disaster disrupts the normal professional response and rescuers may be overwhelmed and unable to reach every victim in time. It is important to keep in mind that even though disaster volunteers are extremely important to disaster response, especially in the provision of first aid, there are limitations to the role of a disaster volunteer. If and when official responders get there, they will take control of providing care to the disaster victims. However, your role will not end because official responders will want a report of what you saw and the care you provided. This is necessary for continuity of care, so be prepared to give as much information as possible. People often wonder if there's really a reason for disaster volunteers or bystanders to be trained in first aid. Is there really such a need? Can't we just rely on official responders? Well, I'd like you to take a look at these three quotes from ordinary bystanders who jumped into action during recent terror attacks and provided life-saving care to victims. The proud father of a U.S. soldier killed in Iraq, who assisted during the chaos of the Boston Marathon bombing, the baggage worker and former Boy Scout who was first on scene at the Brussels airport bombing, and the pub worker who provided care for a bystander hit by crossfire in the London Bridge attacks. Let's read them together. My first instinct was just to run across the street and to start helping people. I was there to help everyone. He was bleeding through his eye. I went to get the first aid kit and I started speaking to his friends and to try and calm them down. These are the heroes who emphasize the need for everyone to be trained in basic first aid skills. In addition to the personal stories, there is evidence from studies by the U.S. military and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in regard to injuries. The studies reveal that severe injuries resulting in death are a widespread problem that can be reduced with improvements in the timeliness and quality of care. Considering that on average, the first official responder will not arrive to an injury until 4 minutes after it has been called in, the need for trained bystanders and volunteers is essential. Now let us turn to the topic at hand, providing first aid during disaster response efforts to disaster victims and others in need of care. The first thing to do is identify the emergency. This may sound simple, but in the tumult of disaster aftermath, it is important to take a step back and form an idea of what the problem is. Is the person grabbing their leg? Does their body appear twisted? Are they breathing very hard? Can you see any blood? You cannot proceed in providing first aid until you've figured out what the issue is. What do we see in this picture? It's difficult to know for sure unless we have a wider angle view, but we can suspect an explosion and/or a fall, and we should be careful before moving the person. Once you've identified what's happening, you need to make sure that the situation is one you can get involved in without compromising your own safety. As we have mentioned, disaster response presents certain hazards to rescuers. You need to decide if the hazard is one you can avoid while offering care or not. Remember that some hazards, for example biohazards, may be avoided by wearing proper personal protective equipment. Other hazards may require advanced training or specialized rescue teams. It may be better to avoid getting involved if you are concerned about your own safety. Disaster victims may have several issues that require attention. Before you start care, try to identify what seems to be the largest issue and care for that first. As a rule of thumb, significant bleeding or difficulty breathing are always high priority. You can also ask the person what bothers them the most and start with that. The last step before providing care is gathering the necessary equipment to care for the problem. Throughout our discussion, we will emphasize the required equipment for specific illnesses and injuries. In disasters that involve many injuries, for example, terrorist attacks, subway derailments, bleeding is likely the most serious problem you will have to treat. Severe bleeding can lead to death in a matter of minutes, so time is of the essence. Even minor bleeds can cause permanent injury to people with pre-existing problems, so the importance of your involvement cannot be stressed enough. Research has shown that direct pressure and tourniquet placement are much more effective in controlling bleeding than elevating limbs or squeezing pressure points. You should first try direct pressure on the wound and then a tourniquet if the direct pressure doesn't work. However, severe bleeding should be controlled with a tourniquet as the first line of defense. As we mentioned, severe bleeding will likely not stop with direct pressure, and a tourniquet has to be your first line of defense. But what is severe bleeding? Well, blood that sprays out of a wound like a fountain. This describes bleeding from large arteries, such as those in the neck, wrists, and groin. Blood that flows quickly like a raging river, not a trickling stream. This describes blood coming out of large veins. A large puddle of blood under the person. Large being a relative term, and that relative term is 1 liter for an average adult, or about the amount of blood that would fill a 1 liter bottle of soda, and 6 to 7 ounces for a small child or infant, or about the amount of blood that would fill a small yogurt container. And finally, bleeding that doesn't stop within a few minutes of direct pressure is also considered severe. Before we discuss the techniques for managing bleeding, let's make sure we are all familiar with the equipment involved. Starting from the left, we have rolls of stretch gauze bandages, then triangular bandages in the bag and out of the bag, and finally sterile gauze pads all the way on the right. All of these will be used in our future discussion. Now, let's jump at the methods for providing care. Exercise 2A, bleeding control with direct pressure. I will read the steps, and in the next slide you will see a video demonstration. Step 1. Put on your personal protective equipment. Gloves, goggles, face mask, gown, whatever is necessary for the situation. Step 2. Apply pressure over the bleeding site with several sterile gauze pads. Step 3. Continue applying pressure until the bleeding has slowed. Step 4. Maintain this pressure by wrapping a stretch gauze bandage around the torso or limb. Remember, do not remove pads or bandages once they have been placed. The bleeding may have already started to clot, and by pulling off the pad or bandage, you can start the bleeding again. If the pads or bandages become soaked, add fresh layers. Do not remove the soaked layers. At the end of the day, the bandage should be secure, but not too tight. The fingertips should not be turning purple.